So I'm very glad to have you all for this exciting and wonderful session. I'm Olivier Do. I will be the moderator of the session. I can see that we have no less than four former prime ministers of different countries around Europe, and two experts joining us also from Italy and from Slovakia. We have a lot of issues to tackle. The main topic you've been receiving, the framing note. The main topic is a bit provocative, but it's challenging the EU and asking if the current situation in Europe and the internet situation is endangering the EU as such. And indeed, the COVID-19 outbreak is a new challenge for the EU governance, which struggled to forge a new agenda and to have a fresh start away from the never-ending Brexit political circumvolution. And while the next multi-annual financial framework is being discussed, and the Commission has proposed a substantial increase of the European budget, which is still under discussion. There's a lot also to be discussed, however, because there are still pending issues to be negotiated, such as the condition of rule of law, which are to be made by state members to benefit, especially the next generation EU plan, which is the big 750 billion euro recovery plans, which is indeed the first time the EU is borrowing on the debt market to help the state member to finance their recovery plans. So as I mentioned previously, there's a lot of to be discussed, but I would like to start with you, Bertie Ahern, with you are a former prime minister. You've been the youngest prime minister of the Irish Republic. You've been leading a country during 10 years, and while your country was booming and economically and experiencing a strong economic growth. Is the EU doing enough to face the new economic challenge that is ahead, and is the recovery plan sufficient, and what should be done according to you to face these new international challenges?
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning to all of my colleagues. Good to see you all, and again, thanks to the Institute for all your good work, always organising them. I'm sorry I'm here in cold Ireland and wet Ireland and not down in your beautiful country enjoying the sunshine, which I've done so many years. You know, I was finance minister for 3 times, and I was prime minister for 3 times. And I remember back 30 years ago when I was Labour minister on the Social Affairs Council, listened to Jacques Delors. There were always problems, there are always issues, and there are always issues of finance and planning and going forward. So I think the EU is one of these evolving stories. That there are issues now, there are issues before, and there are issues in the future. And I think some of the challenges now, I don't think things are worse than they ever were. I don't think they're enormously better, but there are a few positives. I think you've mentioned one. I think the new generation EU plan for the future, the fact that the EU are putting together the 7-year financial package that was passed by Parliament last week, 1.8 trillion, 750 million of that for the new generation funds. I know there's strings attached to that. I know most of the plans won't be put in till next year. The money probably won't start flowing till probably about 2023, 2024. And I know there'll be, the money is linked to reform. It's linked to the EU countries following a set of criteria. And that's usually the same. What's different this time, I think, is, which is very helpful, that in the July stimulus package that the EU are borrowing this money on behalf of the other countries. They're guaranteeing the money. And this, I think, this is a lesson that they've learned from the 2008-2009 period, which would have avoided a lot of problems at that time if they had done a similar issue, which caused a lot of problems in my country. It was a bit past my time, but it did cause a lot of problems in my country, which could have been avoided in my view, but that's an old message. So I see the new generation funds has been good. I see it as been a positive move. I do think member states by and large will link into that, but there'll be the usual negotiation period. Of course, what's I think difficult, that's one point. The next point is, which is very important to us, but I think very important to Europe, is that the UK leave this week that we talk starts I hope what is the final round. I think the final round of negotiations started about 2 hours ago in Brussels between the British and the EU. We are close spectators on that issue. We support the EU position on it. Hopefully a deal can be achieved this week. We're up against the clock, and if it's not done over the next week, 10 days max, it'll be very hard to see the ratification process concluding. There are a number of difficulties. Personally, and I think the Irish government's view is, if I can give that, but I'm not in a position to give that, but if I can give that, it is that this is doable. There are 3 issues really outstanding. There are 3 big issues for the European Union. Just to mention them quickly, there is the future relationship, how this is all going to work out. What kind of relationship will the EU have with Britain in the future? What concessions will they give them? And there is the second issue, the level playing field is number 1. Maybe use the terms that Michel Barnier likes to use. It's a level playing field, is that number 1. Number 2 is the fisheries issue, which I think is doable. That's all about the fish that's caught in British waters by various European countries. I hope that doesn't become the last issue, because it would be extraordinary if this was to break down on fish. Fish is only a fraction of 1% of the EU economy, or the UK economy issue. And the argument about fish, I mean, the British argued that the fish caught in their waters, of course, the fish, a lot of the fish caught in European waters or in British waters start their life in Irish waters, and then they fish over, and they don't carry any passports, so you can't check whether there were British fish or Irish fish or French fish or Portuguese fish. If they had passports, it'd be very easy. We could check it out, but Boris Johnson's made a big issue in this. So I think the solution is tongue-in-cheek, give them all passports, and then we know which fish it is. But in the meantime, fish is a big issue. And the third issue is, how do we resolve the arbitration around this? We know the British, once you mention European Court of Justice, they go into spin, so we can't use that mechanism, but you do need some system that can arbitrate of what happens. So on the basis that I hope there will be a deal, I hope it's a good deal. I think there are some in the British in the British establishment would like no deal, and to see where that goes. It makes no sense. It makes no sense for Britain. It makes no sense for Europe. It would be a disaster for Ireland. I don't want to be parochial, to be local on this, but it would be terrible for us. But I do think there will be a deal, because but it needs to be a deal that makes sense. So that is going to be a challenge for Europe. But Europe, I think, on the other side of Britain leaving, I hold a view, by the way, the same as John Major, the former British Prime Minister, when he said, and I quote his words, that Britain leaving the European Union was the worst foreign policy decision in his lifetime, and he's in his 70s. So that is the view I hold. If people were sold bad information, pure, very bad communication, they got into a nationalist cycle. But anyway, that's where we are. And I think the big thing now is that we get an agreement, and that Europe can move on with a good relationship. I should just briefly mention one of the issues that has not been trashed out, and I think the European Union are going to have to deal with this. A lot of the financial services of Europe are still, and a lot of the euro-denominated business are still dealt in London. Nobody's talking too much about this. There are thousands of jobs linked to this, and I don't particularly wish our near neighbour any ill, though we've had a rows with them in the past. But there's one thing I do not understand, is that if they're out, the financial services business of the EU has to be out too. It probably will go to several different countries. I don't think we will particularly get a lot of it, but I do think it'll go to the Frankfurt and Paris and Luxembourg and elsewhere. But I think EU have to deal with that issue, which has not really been on the radar. But I do think it'll be a 2021 issue very quickly. So they're just a few. But I'm positive about Europe. There always will be challenges. There always will be difficulties. But I am positive, and I do worry about Angela Merkel. We've had our rows with her in the past, but she has been a great bastion of stability and leadership, and I do worry about her moving on. I do worry about what's going to happen. Where are the new leaders of Europe in the future, and who's going to pick up that mantle that she and the Germans have shown over the years that I was there and since then. So I think there are big challenges, and we just have to watch that with great interest.
Thank you very much, Bertie, for those comments and the positive comments. And one quick follow-up question, and with all the reasons you have been also speaking locally, but also more generally on the fate of the EU. But how do you think this Brexit is going to reshape the Irish-UK relation? Is there any perspective to have a win-win solution for the frontier between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland?
Unfortunately, I didn't want to get too much into that, into all our colleagues talking about European dimension, yeah. But it is, I have to say, we made a deal with the British 1 year ago. We agreed an international agreement with them, and I suppose we shouldn't have been surprised based on our 800 years of history, but leave that aside. Unfortunately, 10 months on, the British decided to bring in legislation, which thankfully was defeated last week in the House of Lords, taking out the aspects of it that broke an international agreement. And this is all to do with what happens on the island of Ireland. At the moment, we have, I think as colleagues would know, we have no border. It's a frictionless border. It's a tradeless border. And that was part of the Good Friday Agreement, which I had the honour with Tony Blair of negotiating back in 1998. The British are trying to bring back regulations and are trying to reimpose some of the conditions. They say they're doing that just in case. They're doing it in case there's not an agreement, but it is very unhelpful. And I hope that this week in the final negotiations that the British do not insist in bringing back amendments to the legislation that ignores the House of Lords, ignores international agreements, ignores the agreement that they made with Ireland. I'll take the positive view, and hopefully they don't do that. And as you know, last week, two of the advisors of Boris Johnson, who would have been on the Leave side, have now departed, number 10. So hopefully they won't continue with this strident viewpoint. But anything that creates a border on the island of Ireland, after all our history of that, which you know a fair bit about, would be a disaster. But it's really down to the British. But I do hope the British don't continue with this senseless policy of trying to defeat an international agreement. Because how can you sign up to a new agreement with the UK if the last one that they made a year ago that they're breaking, and that they're determined to legislate to continue that position? It seems to me a no-brainer. But unfortunately, we have that problems with our newer neighbour from time to time.
Well, thank you very much for that comment. And what I wanted to outline maybe during this conversation is also the diversity and the uncertainties the EU is facing all around its frontiers. And so I would like to move to you, Georgios Papandreou. You've been the Prime Minister of Greece from 2009 to 2011. You're the member and a former leader of the Socialist Party, the PASOK, and you experienced the hardest part of the aftermath of 2008 financial crisis, and I'm sure you've been hearing what Bernie said to us on the EU guaranteeing a new borrowing on the market and guaranteeing the borrowing for the member states countries. That's probably something you were dreaming of back in the day in 2009, when you had to negotiate with the EU Commission and the recovery plan and the guarantee for Greece. How is your perspective on what the EU is doing right now on the economic level? And maybe we will have also an opportunity to comment how Greece is dealing also with the actual neighbor in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Well, thank you very much. And it's great to see former colleagues, and thank you for this very important discussion. I agree very much with what Bertie was saying earlier, and he made a very good expose of the situation, not only concerning Ireland, but the whole Brexit issue, and of course, where Europe is going. And as he said, and you mentioned, during the financial crisis, had we as a European Union worked together more systematically vis-a-vis the market fears, so that we could show the markets that we were one union, and concerning particularly the issue of borrowing, we're in one Eurozone, and have we done this early on, the financial crisis would have been much smoother. It would have been difficult, but we would have been able to handle it in a much easier way. We needed time. I needed time to make big reforms in Greece. We were pushed because of the lack of this initial solidarity anyway, by the markets to take very quick measures, very difficult measures, which of course undermined political legitimacy and created problems in this transition, and it ended up with Greece having to be in this program for many, many years. So the fact that the European Union today has decided to pool its risk, if you like, and work together in this new policy for recovery, for a Green Deal, and so on, I think has shown that the EU is moving on, and that's an important point of view, point of information that really gives it new hope. It doesn't mean that they're not problems, as Bertie has mentioned, and I would say that it brings out what the title of the session is, and we have problems in the world, and of course they are, with COVID-19, become very, very deep crisis, which is not just a health crisis, it's also economic crisis, but it has also brought out issues that were underlying, which have been more highlighted much more by the crisis, by this COVID crisis. Deep inequities in many of our societies or between countries, access to health service, access to education. We see that some countries have more, or richer parts of the country have more than other parts of the country. We have a sense of more injustice as certain types of groups are being hit by COVID, minorities, particularly if we see what's happening in the United States, how certain groups have been unjustly and overly hit because of the inequities that exist in the health system and social systems and so on. We see that also the effects of climate change, the issue of technology, how it on the one hand is being used positively to trace and help with COVID and of course finding a vaccine, but at the other hand, used for authoritarian purposes, for surveillance, invading privacy, loss of jobs, what are we going to do? These are huge uncertainties. And I think this is the basis on which we have seen the demagoguery, and as you call it, populism, I like the word demagoguery better, and authoritarian leaders. This authoritarianism, I think, has been dealt, this type of leadership has been dealt a blow, first of all, by the big victory in the United States. Biden's victory is highly symbolic because Trump had given a green light to a type of leadership which was authoritarian, divisive, anti-scientific, without much morality, I would say, principled, certainly also very nationalistic, and undermining multilateralism. Now, multilateralism, of course, is the idea that we work together. There's somewhat of a higher norms and institutions that allow us to cooperate in dealing with issues. And I can understand that some leaders will say, well, we don't want to give this authority to some third institutions globally. And that's one of the reasons why the slogan, take back control in the UK was so popular. It sounds like a democratic slogan. Take back control, we control our own lives, we don't let these bureaucrats somewhere in the world. Yes, but in the end, what we have seen is that this type of a slogan, this nationalistic slogan, has ended up very often in creating new authoritarians, leaders, but also it doesn't deal with the real problems. It doesn't really take back control. You cannot control COVID just alone. You cannot control climate change just alone. You cannot control population movement just alone. So this is, I think, where we have seen this diversion of types of leadership, and Europe as an institution, even though inside Europe there are movements which are more nationalistic, but as an institution is an example we need to, a paradigm we need to keep and develop and strengthen. And I would say now, with the election of Biden, actually the European Union needs to take initiatives, because we need to strengthen a multilateral system, make it more effective, more just, if we want to be able to deal with these challenges in the world. So yes, Europe is challenged. It's not easy to take these decisions. It's not easy to move forward. We're often slow. We're 27, 28, or whatever countries trying to work together. And sometimes these decisions have to be unanimous, very difficult. But at the same time, it is a project which needs to survive, as this is the way we will be dealing with the global issues, working together under some common norms with common institutions. Yes, of course, we need to strengthen our democracies and not lose the sense of control at the local and national level. But at the same time, cooperation at the global and regional level is absolutely imperative if we are going to be capable of dealing with these issues and dealing them in a just way. So we cannot really go back to I think after this COVID crisis, go back to an old normal. We have to have a new normal, which does mean looking at the multilateral system and looking at the deeper injustices we are seeing in our societies and dealing with them. So with the European Union coming with this new program, they talk about, for example, we talk about the idea that this is not simply putting money into companies or investing simply to keep things going, but actually linking that with a very different future, particularly the Paris Agreement, the SDGs, the Green Deal, to make our economy sustainable. So I think this general position, this general way of the way that Europe has dealt with it is a positive one. Now, we haven't been very successful on COVID. I think we should have learned more from Asia. on how we're dealing with COVID, but that's another issue. However, had Europe not been able to deal with the recessionary challenges in a collective way, in a way where we, as Bertie said, we go out and borrow together, we will invest to help each other, we will move towards a more green future. Had we not been able to make these decisions, then I think populism and demagoguery would have been on the rise in Europe. I think the more Europe is efficient, the less we will have this feeling or this chance, this opportunity for certain authoritarian leaders to say, yeah, my nation first.
Thank you, Georgios. You raised a very interesting point, which is there's also a string attached to this use of the recovery plan, the big recovery plan, and the European Commission is going to examine to review each national recovery plan to see if it fits in line with the green the broader perspective of sustainable development and greener economy. Which is a very important position. But also you mentioned the efficiency of the EU. Well, you are both, Bertie and you, are very positive about what's been doing and deciding last July 2020. But in terms of external challenges, Greece is at the forefront of two other external challenges for the EU, which are dealing with migration issues and facing a new kind of international disorder you've been mentioning, where authoritarian leaders advance their international agenda or regional agenda. Are you? I know that Greece is one of the few countries among with France and the Eastern European country to meet the target, the NATO target of the 2% of the defense budget, the 2% of GDP spending in defense. But do you think that more generally the EU is correctly facing the external challenges ahead? I mean, in terms of dealing with Turkey, we're dealing with Russia, dealing with Belarus, which are topics we could also discuss with our next panelists.
Well, I would say that Greece has historically been and still is very close to the French position on the need for Europe to have a stronger defense policy. And defense, of course, defined widely, because we are talking about climate change is a security threat also, and this policy which is much more holistic, but yes, a defense policy which one would hope is basically a deterrent and not a force which we would need to be used to intervene. But that deterrent could be important, because what we're saying in this region, what Greece is saying, and what I have been, of course, both as Prime Minister and for many years Foreign Minister, and I've worked with my counterparts in Turkey, and actually we've had some times which we were doing very well in our relations. We opened up trade, we have had people's diplomacy, we multiplied our economic relations, we had millions of tourists come to Greece and vice versa. So there was, and we had a good dialogue on some of these problems and how we solve them, both our bilateral, but also the Cyprus issue, of course, including both the Greek Cypriot and the Turkish Cypriot community. What we disagree with today and what we are fearful today is that what we see from the leadership of Turkey and from President Erdogan is a militarization of diplomacy, of deciding that through force or through threat of force, one will get his or her way. That is what has created problems. I believe that there is a possibility where we can work much more closely with Turkey if it decides to work within the normal parameters of international legitimacy, nonviolent solutions of conflict through peaceful means, good neighborliness, accepting international law. We need to delimit the maritime zones. Bertie was saying earlier about fishing rights. Well, here we also have the issue of energy, basically gas and oil. However, we need to transition to a green deal, to a green economy, which means we should maybe work more on sustainable energy, which should bring us together rather than move us apart. So we need to delimit these zones, but this should be done through a systematic dialogue and not through show of force or unilateral actions. That is the message that Europe needs to very clearly state towards Turkey. It has done so in different decisions, but the question is then, what is its power? How is it going to leverage its power in a way to actually bring Turkey back, not to isolate Turkey? That's not what we want. We're a neighbor, we want good cooperation, but to bring them back to a more normal relationship with us. And of course, there are difficult issues which we will have to deal with. The migration issue, the refugee issue is a big issue. And we have to admit that Turkey is taking up a huge burden with more than 3 million refugees from not only Syria, but from other parts of the world. So yes, we do want to recognize that there are difficult problems that Turkey is facing, but these problems will not be solved through a threat of violence or through violence itself. And that, I think, has to be a very clear message.
Thank you very much, Georgios, for this comment. Which are very balanced and enable also to see a more general framework of the EU, which is to advance with norms and positivity, and also with international right. And I would like to give the floor to Andris Kubilius, which has Andris, you have been also Prime Minister of Lithuania, your country. You are today, as of today, you are a European MP, and you are also your party has done very well for what I know in the last election in 2020, with 50 out of 140 seats at the parliament, and I think your party is affiliated at the European level to the PPE, the European People Party, which is the leading party at the parliament. So how do you see the work from inside the institution, from inside the European institution, and from also your national perspective on what's been doing the EU so far?
Well, thanks a lot. Good morning to everybody, and really pleasure. I will try to be very brief, since despite pandemic and despite the fact that European Parliament is more or less closed, we are still continuing to work online, teleworking, and I have exactly a committee meeting starting very soon. So unfortunately, I will leave after my intervention. But really, I was Prime Minister also during the crisis, 2008, 2012. So I know what does it mean. I remember very well, how we were sitting together with Prime Minister Papandreou, and others, So I would say I am optimist about EU and general, on global developments. And when we are talking about populism, unfortunately, that is a phenomenon which is, in some period of times are repeating, and that is perhaps unavoidable. And from my point of view, 2016 was what we can call a terrible year from populism, point of view. We got Donald Trump, we got BREXIT, and in Lithuania at that time we got also quite a populistic, party which won elections, exactly on the same, populistic or demagogical, statements. And that was, outcome both of before that, global financial crisis and perhaps of refugee crisis. We remember very well all those events which came before 2016. Now, when I'm looking around, I see that really, things are moving into much more positive direction. As it was mentioned before, we have Joe Biden, winning in United States. We have our party winning elections in Lithuania. again, we see that those who came with populistic slogans, into Lithuanian government before, they lost elections. And it looks for me that really some kind of this, more pro-democratic wind is blowing through all, electorates in democratic countries everywhere. So that's what we can see as a positive outcome. And of course, EU, learned quite heavy lessons after last, 2008, 2012, financial crisis. Really, it's totally different now. I remember very well when we were hit by the crisis back in 2008, 2009, and when our GDP went down by minus 15 or 16%. And the big issue was where to borrow money. And we were borrowing, with a high price. And that was really, we needed to cut all the expenditure and so on and so on. Of course, people were very unhappy. Now with EU decision, with the European Central Bank decision to issue, new money, quantitative easing and so on, with EU decision, Commission and Council and Parliament decision to have recovery fund, there is no problem with money. The question is, are we spending the money, in a prudent way? Then, the problems will come when we shall need, to answer the question where we spend those money and how we are going to repay, the debts. Debts are increasing, but in general, for time being, I do not see any kind of any big problems. Even, with pandemic, we see that, for example, Ireland is showing great example how they are managing, to fight against second wave. There are positive, positive signals even from other countries, even from Belgium, which for time being before, 1 month ago, it was terrible numbers and everything was closed and Parliament leadership said, go home, and don't appear in Brussels. Now numbers are going down. So I think that Europe really is able to fight even pandemics. And this spread of, democratic values is really bringing quite an interesting and big changes. I hope that they will be positive in our eastern neighborhood. We saw, recently what we can call revolutionary uprisal in Belarus. Of course, that is still continuing, but people are showing in a very clear way that they don't want to stay with authoritarian, autocratic, old regime of Lukashenko. That is very, very clear. This night we got very positive numbers, very positive, news from Moldova, another country which had all the, post-Soviet problems. Maya Sandu from EPP family, pro-European former prime minister, won elections with huge margin against, former president who was very much, connected with Moscow, with Kremlin. So we see some developments even in Russia. So that's what we don't know how things will move, but in any case, really, I think that we are coming out from this, wave of populism. We're coming to the wave of what I could call, much more pro-democratic. And that can bring a lot of change, not only around EU, but even inside of EU. And that is what, makes me, to be optimist about EU future, despite unfortunate development with Britain, which perhaps is the most painful victim of that populism wave back in 2016, and Brexit. But I would call that Brexit is more of British, how to say, issue, not of their historical, mindset and so on. It's not an European issue. And that's what we can, conclude, that despite all the problems, Europe is continuing to be really quite strong and even improving, as it was since very beginning. After each crisis, Europe is coming out with some new instruments, new ideas, and that makes Europe stronger. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Andres. If I may ask a quick follow-up question on Belarus. How do you see there the room for the EU to engage with Lukashenko regime and to have a positive impact on the outcomes that could be put forward? One of the risks that have been described is that Lukashenko regime tried ties, to tie more links with Russia, and the EU could have less leverage in the future in that country. So where Lukashenko used to have a balanced approach between Russia and the EU. So how do you see the perspective here, and how the EU has a room for diplomacy and to leverage the political outcome in this country?
Well, I don't see any good perspective to have any kind of approach towards Lukashenko regime. I think that Lukashenko regime is almost over. The question is only time. So the only factor which keeps him in power is, open or hidden support from Kremlin, from Putin. But even as we can read, messages from Moscow, from Russia, I think that they are also understanding that perhaps Lukashenko time is over, and the question is, how to win for Moscow, how to keep its influence after the change. So that is why they are making some maneuvers and so on and so on. For Moscow, it's also a big problem, because if they will stay with Lukashenko for a long period of time, then in the eyes of Belarusian people, not only Lukashenko will become toxic, but also Putin will become toxic. And that is where really I think that changes will come. EU has, of course, not so big, influences on the processes, since Lukashenko is not answering any phone calls, and of course, EU has not a big leverage on Kremlin. But nevertheless, I would say that we can keep our pressure, we can keep our political support towards people of Belarus. There are several ideas what we can do back in Brussels, in European Parliament, with maybe creation of high-level mission, which would consist of former presidents or prime ministers, in order really to consolidate our position towards Belarus, to be more outspoken, and so on. There are initiatives to create special center for international investigation for MON crimes. That is also we are pushing forward. So there are things which we can do, and I hope that really the change will come into Belarus.
Thank you for that comment, Andres. It's very useful to have your perspective, and I would like to give the floor now to one of your former colleague and neighbor, Tavi Roivas. I hope I'm pronouncing well your name. You've been Prime Minister of Estonia from 2014 to 2016 with the Reform Party, which is affiliated at the European level to Renew Europe, the group, the center political group. You're also an innovator, and Estonia is well known to be an international leader in EU government and the use of new technology. I read somehow that you intended to quit politics. I hope it's not out of despair for the perspective of political action, and maybe you could tell us more. But from your perspective and from your generation also, because you're one of the youngest panelists here, and what could be done at the EU level, and what you believe should be done more to move the EU forward?
Well, thank you very much for this kind introduction, and it's a huge pleasure to be part of this very, very distinguished panel. And I assure you, me leaving politics to work for tech sector, to bring investments to Estonia, and also to help Estonian companies to internationalize has nothing to do with my belief on where Europe or Estonia is going. Far from it. I just see lot of positive opportunities for digitalization and tech companies, and thus this particular move. I am equally optimistic as the colleagues on the topics that were covered, and on European Union working together. I think the reason why Europe is very often, or EU is often associated with different crises, is because we are dealing with many crises at EU level, and thus it's not about the crisis as it is solving the crisis at EU level. As you correctly said, I was Prime Minister during 2014 to 16, and during these years we had several crises also to deal with, to find the common solutions, and I think EU did it much more effectively than we could ever do it country by country alone. Just migration crisis being one of the examples, and the sovereign debt crisis was already mentioned several times by all the panelists. Now, talking about this current crisis, I would see two aspects. First of all, the health impact is decided to be tackled at national level. This is a competence of countries, not so much EU, and thus it's logical. We saw some initial shock at many countries where closing borders happened very quickly, where acting alone rather than together was one, this kind of sentiment. But at this current moment, I think that we have learned from the early spring, and I think hopefully we will survive the health impact sooner rather than later. But where Europe comes to play definitely is, of course, the economic impact and how we can survive the crisis economically. There, obviously, we are stronger when we act together. One of the things, of course, is the additional allocation of European level funds. And there, I think it's, as was also mentioned by others, it's extremely important where we allocate these funds. If we just get our spending up during the time when our tax revenue is actually decreasing, we will never get out of this spiral of overspending. But what we need to do, of course, is to address the particular sectors that have been hurt most, and also, of course, not wasting a good crisis in terms of getting EU and EU countries to the next level. I think the basic idea of allocating a large part of these additional funds to tackle climate change and also digital developments is absolutely right one, and this is exactly what we should be doing. Yeah, on there has been so many topics covered. Actually, I don't even know which ones to comment. I just want to say that I also agree that taking defense policy and overall wider security very seriously is the only way to do it. I don't think that we can really separate European security from the overall transatlantic security architecture. But of course, having said that, it's essential that all the European countries take their own commitments seriously as well. And this is, of course, important in military spending, but it's also important when we address energy security, digital sovereignty, all those topics as a wider security architecture.
Maybe just a quick comment on you in the Baltic countries had a tough time during also the Trump administration because of the insistence also of the US on which Eastern European countries are mostly relying on on security issues, the insistence of the US for the European country to meet the expectation in terms of budget spending in defense, and the threats to withdraw the US troops. And actually, I think that some of the US troops on Estonian soil have been removed by the Trump administration. So how is the dynamic also on the new thinking? Is there new thinking in the Eastern European countries on what has been called not independent European defense, but autonomous strategy of the European defense? Something that the idea that European countries could have some autonomous space inside the transatlantic alliance in the case of if the US is failing to the engagement or failing to the European countries' securities.
In September 2014, when Russia had invaded Ukraine and Europe was discussing, and then NATO was discussing how to strengthen itself, Barack Obama said these words in Tallinn, that defending Tallinn, Vilnius, and Riga is equally important than defending Paris, London, and Berlin to his administration and to the United States of America. And that was a very, very serious commitment, not only verbally, but that was also a serious commitment in terms of allocating American resources to actually make sure that the eastern part of NATO is equally strong than let's say, Western countries. And I don't think that, in essence, that the commitment has changed from US side, but of course, removal of troops, not from Estonia, but from Germany, or at least the promises to remove some of the troops from Germany or other Central or Western European countries. Of course, it influences European security. Not Estonian security, not Lithuanian, not Greek or Irish, but European security. And I don't think that in the 21st century it is possible to see that one NATO country or one EU country is not free or not independent, and all the rest of us are going on as nothing happens. I think this is possible, and I think that US should continue to play an important role in NATO, and I'm sure that they will. I have met the next president or the elected president of the United States several times, and I'm absolutely certain that he's very much committed to transatlantic security. So I don't think that we should be particularly worried on that. But having said that, of course, it's only logical that if we have committed together in NATO that each and every one of us spends at least 2% of GDP on defense, well, of course we should do that. And that's the only way to do it, to keep our promises and honor our commitments.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I just feeling a wave of optimism on the EU in this panel, and maybe our expert also could be challenging that question. Maybe I would give the floor to Jakub Wiśniewski. I hope I am pronouncing your name well. Jakub, you are the vice president of GlobSec, which is a think tank based in Slovakia, and dealing also a lot with engaging a lot with the European, the Center Eastern and Center European countries, which are somehow named by the group in the Visegrad group, which is waiting much in the vote inside the European Union institutions. yourself, you're Polish, you are an ambassador, and you've been head of foreign policy planning at a Polish foreign ministry. And you wrote an essay last year saying, a short essay saying that what the danger for Europe is the West-East divide, and not so much, and that's the topic, and that is fueling populism among the center Eastern European country. You've been hearing that from Andres, for example, that maybe the wave of populism and demagoguery was to an end in Europe. We know that also global financial crisis in 2008 has been, or the migration crisis have been a huge help to populist movement. And is there a fear that this COVID-19 crisis and the economic aftermath of it is fueling again populism in Europe? Or do you think that some experience like Brexit, for example, is clearly shifting is clearly proving that in a way going out of the European Union is not a positive perspective for the countries. So what's your take on that?
Hello, Bratislava is very gray and misty, so I very much wish I was there in Tangier. And I guess, I hope that next year we can all meet there normally. And
definitively.
I want to say something, and it's very difficult to say something clever after all these comments of my distinguished colleagues. And I very much want to introduce a little bit of pessimism or sadness, just to bring back the balance. Because on general, of course, I agree with you that the European Union has not had such a bad crisis, but at the same time, it's very difficult to find a sort of an inspiring way forward into predictable future, some eschatological moment where we all gonna be saved in some Europe of tomorrow. It's much more complicated, and I guess it's much more mundane, kicking the can down the road, so to say. And each Macron has some Marine Le Pen waiting for him to fail. So there is always some populist background, even if we have a very nicely working Franco-German motor in the center of the EU decision-making system. It can fall apart. It can fall apart. Britain was never central to the European project, even it is central to the interests of Ireland. But Germany or France would be. If these countries departed from the EU, it would mean the end of the European integration. But I don't want to go into such catastrophic scenarios because I don't see this happening anytime soon. But at the same time, I could maybe make a point that Europe of tomorrow will be different in a way that it will be much more fragmented with different speeds of integration on the part of member states. It is not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe it brings some cohesion to the European project, where member states which are really convinced to go into some form of cooperation, they do it, while the rest is waiting on the sidelines, on the margins, and maybe looking for their own moment to join the bandwagon, so to say. You mentioned the East-West divide. Yes, this is a serious point of concern. And actually, while I was listening to the Greek and Irish colleague, I was thinking about Greece and Ireland several decades ago, when these countries were developing rather well. But there was, and after several years of prosperity, there came a moment of certain, how to say, confusion among the population, for example, as regards some traditional values. What is the position of Catholic Church in the society? What does the society think about LGBT rights, or traditional position of women in the family or in the society? And I think that we neglected these questions when Central Eastern Europe was joining the European Union back in 2004. It was relatively easy to change laws, to restructure economies, to get prepared. And we did not pay enough attention to the social disruption that was happening, that many people had to change their professions. Many people were enormous social disparities emerged. For example, this geography of discontent, which is the characteristic of today's world in general, but I think is especially acute in countries like Slovakia or Poland, where you have liberal elites in big cities and quite forgotten communities in little towns or villages with no proper access to public communication, proper education, etc. And this creates frustration. This creates a certain rebellion against the established truths. And we have had in response a sort of a whole range of mini Trumps in the region, mini Donald Trumps who have been in power in the region, and to a certain extent they are still deciding the shape of these countries. And I would not underestimate this phenomenon for the future of Europe, because the democratic institutions are very fresh. It's easy to manipulate, say, the independence of judiciary, to affect the non-partisan character of the media, to change the constitution through certain shenanigans so that the governing party stays in power. And without proper response on the part of European institutions as regards rule of law, this might create a long-lasting estrangement with the center of Europe, and actually a sort of bifurcation where we have certain democratic standards in the core of the European Union, and on the margins we have countries which are veering towards authoritarian politics and policies. So I don't want to sound too pessimistic. I think that this can still be worked out, especially that majority of societies of the countries in Central Eastern Europe are very much pro-European. But with each passing month and each passing year, the governments who have authoritarian leanings are trying to manipulate the crowds, so to say, to stoke certain fears and hatreds. And Euroscepticism is very well used by some politicians in power in order to make their grip on power much, much tighter. We need to stay tuned. We need to see how it's going to develop, but this is a huge risk for the European Union, mostly for the region in question, Central Eastern Europe, because I believe that it's existential to Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, that these countries stay together with the European Union.
And you're very right to mention that. And furthermore, we mentioned also at the very beginning that there's some strings attached to the EU recovery plan to benefit from that next EU generation package. And at the time being, I understood that some leadership, especially in Poland or maybe in other Eastern and Central European countries, are opposing these strings attached, and actually this package has to be voted with unanimity at the European Council. So how do you see the perspective of this package being passed before the end of the year, before December 2020? Or how could you develop on the ongoing negotiations that are taking place?
Well, I am of the opinion that the European Union will not give up on its values and the rule of law procedures that have been adopted by Parliament, and also will be the defining factor of how the money from the recovery fund is distributed. Whether countries like Hungary and Poland can be spoilers, can perform the role of throwing a spanner into the wheels of the upcoming decisions, yes, it can happen, but the collateral damage to these countries would be enormous. So I think it's mostly bluff. I don't think that Orban or Kaczynski will decide for such a nuclear option. And even if it happened in the longer run, this would go against, this would be futile, so to say, because you can always, through certain political decisions, take the decisions or take the recovery money out of the framework of the European Union and have it as an intergovernmental agreement, such as in the case of fiscal pact in the past when Great Britain was opposing and vetoing the decisions. Of course, in the case of a European budget, it would be very complicated and probably would result in a major rift in the center of the European Union. But sooner or later, there might be such a showdown of, say, Mr. Orban against the rest of the European Union. But I don't think that Germany or the rest of Western Europeans are ready for a big compromise at this stage.
Thank you very much, Jacob. And I would like to give the floor to Antonio Villafranca. Antonio, you are the research coordinator and co-head of the Europe and Global Governance Center at IPSI, which is the Istituto per gli Studi di Politica Internazionale.
Perfect.
And you wrote a very insightful report which is available on the website of your institute, and a chapter especially which is named "A Revived EU Identity in the Age of Nationalism." And I wanted to link with what Jacob just said on maybe European projects being mostly owned by a liberal elite. And in fact, you described the core identity of the EU as therefore strictly related to its ability to deliver both in the domestic and international domains by building upon liberal values and norms. So for you, fundamentally, the European project is liberal, and so is it disposed in the European norm and also in the way to the European Union has to act internationally and internally. So how do you see the European governance facing those challenges? There's a lot of insight in your essay, but I would like to give you, of course, the privilege to expose also your thoughts and reflection on the upcoming challenges.
So thank you very much, Olivier. Thank you for this opportunity for joining such an outstanding panel. Let me put it this way. If we put together COVID-19, Brexit, populism, recession, you're totally right. You put it in the title. Is it the end of the EU? So let me answer right away. Well, not necessarily and not so fast. Because, I mean, what is sure is that this is the end of the European immobilism. Because frankly speaking, over the last years, the European Union has been in a quagmire for too long. Now it's crystal clear to everybody, starting from the European leaders. The same leaders who were very careful in managing previous crises, who used different tools for different crises. I have the honor to be in the panel with the former Prime Minister of Greece. Yes, of course, the way we are tackling this crisis is substantially different in terms of principles, in terms of vision, in terms of solidarity, of the way we tackled also previous crises. So, I mean, this is precisely, what people are interested in this moment. I mean, what are the effects of the COVID-19? What are the effects of the recession, the economic crisis? Well, if we had Brexit to the equation, basically they don't really care, frankly speaking, because COVID-19 has infected Brexit too, in a way. I mean, it was a huge argument, a huge issue some months ago, and definitely before the pandemic. It's not like this. It's not felt like this after the pandemic. It's like a sort of technical issues for Euro bureaucrats. I mean, this is not my personal point of view, of course, but this is, what you feel, this is the prevailing perception of people, because they are much more preoccupied by the economic and social consequences of the crisis. And so that's why let me just give me a few minutes, to have an idea, also to present an idea of the evolution of the crisis over the last 8-9 months, because there are basically three phases. The first phase, let's call it the winter shock, was quite a positive phase in political terms. Well, it was dramatic in terms of infections. Last March, my country, Italy, was the first European country to be hit by the pandemic, soon to be followed by many others. By June, over 35,000 people had died in Italy, 175,000 in the EU. But European member states were able to respond. They had the fiscal capacity to respond. They used their national bazooka in an unprecedented way. We suspended, all the criteria at the EU level in terms of deficit and debt as well, of course. And we were able to provide concrete answers after years of immobilism. Of course, the most important one being the new generation EU. And there was also a very positive impact for political leaders around Europe. The same solidarity was visible at the political and social level. Let me just give you some numbers in terms of popularity of European leaders. Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte jumped from 44% in February to 71% in March. Macron from 30% to 41%. Merkel from 50 to 68, even Johnson from 44% to 65%. So, I mean, that was the moment in which we were able to show inside each European country and across Europe to show really solidarity. Then there was a second phase, which I call it the Midsummer Night Dream, just to recall Shakespeare, in which we had the feeling, the impression that we could overcome the crisis. Actually, we were recovering. Also, the number of deaths was falling, and it was, of course, in June, July. Then there was, the current phase, the third phase, which is the autumn awakening from our Midsummer Night Dream. Because now the new wave of infection can be even more severe than the first one, but there are some, things which are different from the first phase, because in the first phase we were able to proceed with the new generation Europe. Well, actually, we still, as we know, we still have to strike the final deal, and there is just a small detail. We also have to ratify all these through 27 parliaments, which is not so easy to do. But the point is that in terms of fiscal capacity, now that there is a second wave, we are not ready. We are not, we don't have the fiscal capacity to do even more than that, with Italy's debt going to 160% of GDP, with also the French debt going very close to 120%. Even Germany had to abandon, its, strict view on the 60% of debt to GDP. Now, I mean, the fiscal capacity is almost over. So now we are entering a new phase, which, of course, we will see whether the vaccine, will be introduced early next year. So finally, we can, escape the fate of a new wave of contagion. But, this is the tricky part of all these phases, because, now people are really tired. We see protests in the streets also in Europe, in Italy. In Italy, you probably remember people singing in the balcony during the first wave. Now, a lot of people, fueled, unfortunately, by extremists, are also in the street, because they cannot bear the economic situation anymore. So this is the real challenge for Europe. And unfortunately, just to include Brexit at the very end, Brexit is not felt as, the real problem. This is not our view, of course, but this is not the case anymore. I'm quite optimistic on Brexit because now I think that Johnson feels more alone after Biden administration. With the Biden administration, the UK-US free trade agreement is not anymore around the corner. Frankly speaking, it was not around the corner also under Trump's administration, but it's still even far now. So I mean, optimistically, let's say in a couple of weeks we should have a Brexit agreement. Otherwise, Brexit, we just had uncertainties to uncertainties. But the real issue is how we can escape the third phase of this infection, and what the European Union is able to do early next year to provide to send the signals to citizens that they are still there, also beyond Next Generation EU. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Antonio. And as you mentioned rightly, that some sacred cause of the EU economic policy has been killed or sacrificed in that pandemic, during that pandemic, to respond to that pandemic outbreak. And so the 3% expense on GDP deficit is not on the table anymore. The 60% debt on GDP is not on the table anymore, but since 2008 financial crisis, it's not really on the table anymore. There's a risk of political instrumentalization of the anger of the people in that third phase. In that third phase you mentioned, and so still as Bertie mentioned previously, the money of the recovery plan is only to be flow in 2023 or maybe 24. So it's a long time to have an economic response to the challenges we are facing. I would like to give the floor back to Bertie Ahern. So it's not because Joe Biden is from Irish origin that I'm addressing you first, but either any initiative that should be undertaken to restore the transatlantic relation after with the Biden administration, and either short-term outlook on what can be done to stabilize European but also US economies. And I must mention that in your paper, and the Antonio paper also mentions the inequities, growing inequities rising in Europe among the European countries since 2013, which is something also that is fueling populism. There's also mentioned by Georgios that inside the European countries, there's and Jacob mentioned it also, that there's inequality rising also inside each European countries. I guess it's pretty much the same in the US, and what we have been seeing leading to Trump election in 2016 is also a question of territories and states being slowly disindustrialized. So what is the perspective to the economic and long-term perspective to meet the challenge of inequities and rising populism?
Well, I think Oliver, the challenge going into, and we've just heard what Jacob has said, Antonio, about going into 2021, obviously how the virus is going to be handled, and that's a big issue for Europe. It's a big issue for America. Yesterday was the third day, or the third or fourth day in America where they went over 100,000 cases. You know, it is only 6 weeks ago I remember watching CNN one night, and they said hopefully they won't go back over 60,000 again. That's only 6 weeks ago. And unfortunately, the one thing we've learned, I suppose we've all learned a lot about the virus. The deaths follow about 3 to 4 weeks after the high figures. So that means as we go to Christmas period in the United States, towards the end of the year, they're going to be faced with huge deaths, unfortunately. So that's going to set a lot of the sense of where we're going into the new year, and that's not very positive. Hopefully at that stage, President Biden will be getting ready in a more freer way than he is at present to be able to handle the situation. Though I don't have much confidence that Mitch McConnell and the Democrats will get on much better going into 2021. So I mean that is a worry, and it's a worry for everyone. But I think what George made a point early on the more positive front. Biden is a multilateralist. He will change that terrible last 4 years in my view. He will. And in the early days, he will join up again to the Paris climate change. He will start working again with the WHO. It will give a great boost. I think he will start talking to the European Commission again rather than talking down at them. So I think all these things will give a positive list. He has to get through his stimulus package, and he has to get through what will be big for climate change. It'll be big for the whole technology area where he's committed to putting a lot of resources in. So these will be all positive. Let's say he gets that through, though that's not going to be easy. We'll have the 2 elections in Georgia in January, early January. We'll see what way that helps out. But I mean, it doesn't look very good that the Senate will be very helpful to his package. But I think the very fact he's in after January 20, the fact he has shown the multilateralist tendencies that he has, the fact that he's committing to working with world figures again, I think that will be good. I think Europe. And the one concern, I think we're all positive, but the one concern I do have about Europe is that as the furlough schemes die off, and as the Christmas period, because it is in all countries, it does bring holiday season, and it does help GDP figures, and it helps VAT revenues and all of that. But January does the opposite. January tends to bring a lot of colder, bleaker weather, and I think there will be high redundancies. I think as the furlough schemes go, I think the redundancy figures will start showing it in a lot of countries, which means higher unemployment. And that's going to be a challenge. And I think the first quarter, I know we're all excited about a vaccine, but listening to the experts, if you take the hype out of it, we're not going to see much success on the vaccine until probably May, June at the earliest. I mean, that seems to be what the experts have been saying over the weekend. So we have to live with this for the first half of next year. So I think the first half of the year is going to be difficult enough, but I really think that Biden. I've met Biden many times. He's close to the country, as Robinson said. He is very much a person, a team player. He takes advice. He won't have to run around the United States having silly rallies to try and help his ego. He'll be able to stay in the White House and stay in Washington and meet people and engage with people and talk to people and I think that will give a confidence, and his team will, are multilateralists. His team are people who respect NATO, respect the European Commission, respect the Canadians, Australians. So I think there will be a big lift around the place. But his first 6 months, I think, will be difficult. And the virus being number one, trying to deal with the Senate number two. And, regrettably, I think we haven't said it yet, but one of the extraordinary things is the election was very good for Joe Biden. The election was very bad for the Democrats. The Democrats have a challenge how to play it. People might have different views on it, but my view is that the centre left feel very aggrieved that they were screwed by the left, and a lot of the seats and the votes that should have went with them didn't go well with them because socialism, whether it was right or wrong, got into the electorate of a number of sections of America. And remember, the Democrats the week before the election were very strong in their view that we're going to win Florida. They were hammered in Florida, and they have problems and concerns, and they themselves are going to have a bit of soul searching, and Biden is going to have to manage to lead that too. So there are real challenges. I'm optimistic, but I just think the first 6 months of next year is not going to be a lap of honor for any of us. I think it's going to be a tough 6 months.
Yeah, it's the most probable of the major probability is that Biden administration is firstly looking inward in what is to be done in the USA before to engage multilateral action and dialogue, and maybe in the meantime the EU should be in the capacity also to deliver something in health issue. Tavi mentioned previously that health was health system where each country were responsible for its own health system. But is there a way to propagate the vaccine and to buy in a coordinated way the vaccine and to distribute in each European country? That's something that may be on the table in the coming months or so, I think. And there's a question also raised by the audience, because you know that we are live on the Facebook page of the MEDays Institute, and maybe that's a question I would like to raise to Georgie also and to comment also the point made by Bertie on the balance between center left and left in the US could be something that you could challenge also. So the question is, what is done regarding enhancing education and increasing the low wages in Eastern European countries that causes waves of people moving from countries like Croatia, Poland to work in the West Europe? I would rephrase also for you, Georgios, is Europe doing enough in terms of equalizing the social condition and the working condition in the territory of each member state? It is something that should be on the agenda also.
What Antonio said earlier, I think I liked his point of the EU showing that it's now becoming, it's moving away from its immobilization. And I think that was what we have been seeing the last 10, 15 years, where crisis after crisis, the EU had difficulty in rethinking how it should work as its structures, sometimes its institutions, but mostly its policies. Institutions, of course, have basically been changed, even if they're not officially, like the Maastricht Treaty or helping bail out countries and so on. But I think what is important is that we have to realize that the European Union has much more capacity than we think. We have somehow lived with a sense that Yeah, we can't really do too much. It's very difficult, but it shows that when we do have the political will and we do get together, we actually can make a difference. Now, in the financial crisis, it took a long time, and it created more problems. And I think that was one of the basis for populism or the demagoguery, because what it did is it started to a blame game between countries. Who were the good Europeans, who were the bad Europeans, who were the hardworking Europeans, who were the lazy Europeans. Greece was one of the lazy ones, although we worked more hours than anyone else, according to the OECD. But still, this was the image that was portrayed, and that undermined the European Union. Once we started working together with Draghi saying whatever it takes and so on, it showed the capacity of the European Union. The same, of course, we had with the refugee problem. And I think we still haven't completely dealt with this, because we will get new waves of refugees, whether we like it or not. There already are, but maybe not as massive as in 2015 and 16, but still, we will have this as a problem. So these are issues. How do we use the capacity we have? So what we have shown today, or in this crisis, is that with difficulties, we can mobilize resources and mobilize, if we have the political will, the tools to deal with some of these problems. Now, these problems are difficult, and Jakob was saying they're not going away. And amongst them, of course, is the question of unemployment. Amongst them is the question of inequities between and inside our countries. One thing we saw, which I think the Central and Eastern European countries have seen earlier, is a huge migration of the most talented, most educated young people away from Greece. So in the last 10 years, more than 500,000 young people who were very productive and talented, digital, as Davi was mentioning, is important, ready for change, they've left. So that immediately creates a society much more conservative, much more fearful, particularly in the countryside, where you have this rural-city divide. So I think this is a challenge that Europe has to take up. The Green Deal should then look at the issue of unemployment, of training. Many years ago, when I was Prime Minister, but later on it was discussed. Why don't we do an Erasmus for the unemployed, where people can really be, helped out to get the skills for a new sustainable type of economy. So the issue of redistribution of resources, of training our workforce to deal with the new challenges, becoming more resilient as a society. I think we have made some important steps, but this will be a challenge for the European Union in the next period. I just wanted to add that as Biden, I agree very much with Bertie on the challenges that Biden has. I think that here is where the European Union again should step up and not simply wait for the overtures that the new president will make towards the European Union. We have to also take the lead on some things too. He will have difficulties internally, but I think we also have to show that Europe no longer is simply a follower of US policy in many areas, but that it can also be a guide or taking the lead in certain areas and move the US along. Just look at what's happened recently in the East, in Asia, where a number of countries have come together with China to create some form of a common market. Because Trump basically didn't move on the TTP, which with all its difficulties, how is Europe going to play a role in Asia? How is it going to play a role in Africa? How can we bring the US along to play a constructive role and not move into a mode which Trump really fueled, of the sort of rivalry between China and the US? So there are big issues, I think, where Europe can step up and play a role and be somewhat more, as I think Emmanuel Macron has talked about, the sense of more strategic autonomy. This is something we need to work on.
Thank you, George, also for that comment, and also more generally, we've been examining a lot of issues and external issues around Europe. We have not very much been looking down south, and you mentioned the relationship with Africa, and maybe we should extend that thinking to all the Mediterranean countries, southern country, and you know that the MEDays Institute is very much working actively on forging new link among the African countries, forging new ideas of cooperation between Europe and southern Mediterranean countries, and with the feeling that sometimes Europe is not very responsive also. So is there a new role to play for foreign policy in Europe? Joseph Borrell, the newly appointed representative for foreign policy, is Spanish national, is pretty much aware of all the challenges of the southern countries, but there's somehow the feeling that not all countries are very expert in all the problems that are to solve around the European Union. Some countries are more devoted to look at Eastern relations, relation with Russia, with other country at East. Other countries are looking more down south. So how do we manage to have a common and a shared view and an effective foreign policy, and clearer messages with the partners of the European countries? So maybe that's a question I would like to ask, maybe to Tavi also, and from this experience, from his own experience, how does it look for an Estonian prime minister to be talk on problems that are to solve with migration issues, that are to solve with southern Mediterranean borders? So how do we approach this problem?
Well, when I was listening to what Georgios had to say, and also your remarks on being more the need to be more active on African direction, a funny thing popped to my mind. I read this recent, very long and very thorough interview with Macron, and actually he mentioned Estonia in the context of Estonia being France's closest ally in Mali, which was just a interesting coincidence that you brought this up. But now to the question, I think the best thing to coordinate our common efforts, and I agree with all of you that has been said, that EU is actually much stronger than we sometimes think, and our joint efforts can have even stronger impact as they do. The best thing that we have actually is that, and this is something Bertie and Georgios have experienced themselves in their lives. The best thing is that our leaders meet basically every month, and you are in the room of 30 people or so. There is 27 heads of government plus a couple of more people, and within this room, in this duration of usually 2 or 3 days, if you cannot coordinate your positions, then there is no hope at all. So in a way, the best way to get this common voice and common approach is the fact that we actually meet regularly and we discuss those issues. And of course, as it was said before, if there is political will, there is basically nothing that we cannot achieve. On other things that were mentioned, just to comment very quickly, I think it is extremely important to address the issue how Europe and European Union in particular can be stronger after the crisis. I think we are going in the right direction vis-a-vis the additional funds being used in making Europe either stronger or healthier or more digital or more green. This is going in right direction. but also we have to think how can we learn from the crisis in order to be more resilient towards all sorts of crises. Next crisis will not probably be virus, but we should really learn from this huge shaking that we have been taking. How can we be more resilient, and then how can we learn from also from the mistakes? Like in the first months of the crisis, let's say February, March, perhaps even April, we still were fighting between each other in terms of who will get what kind of personal protective equipment, instead of cooperating properly, instead of having common reserves or proper common action. So in a way, there is also things we can learn from. And last point, of course, I agree that the economic hit will most probably still come. In terms of jobs, in spring, some companies overreacted and they have already rehired some people, but there was also a lot of postponement of letting people go. And if this comes, that won't be very easy on many of our countries. And I'm not very optimistic on the additional fiscal potential as well, because even in my own country, which has been historically extremely prudent on public finances, we before the crisis we only had 8% of GDP sovereign debt, but even for us it will pile up to 32% in only a couple of years, so quadruple. And you might say that 32% it's not much, it's still less than many others have, but the point is that once you get to a deficit, which in Estonian case will be next year 6.7% of GDP, and this is not like one-off investments, it's mainly actually piling up different costs that will continue. We all know that it's extremely difficult to get out of that deficit, and this will continue to pile up, and it will be even more difficult to introduce any reforms afterwards. So what I want to tell with that is that the point that Andrius made a few moments ago, that it's not only excessive spending, but it's also looking that where we actually are spending this money, and that whether it will actually have an effect of making, first of all, our own country and whole of Europe more resilient to future crises and more stronger also economically.
Thank you very much. And Jakub, you are an experienced diplomat, and I would like to have your
Can I say something about Morocco or Africa or neighborhood of Europe in general?
Of course.
We owe it to our hosts that we take up this subject and pay attention to the fact that Europe or the European Union has certain responsibilities towards its neighborhood, be it MENA region, but also it can be Eastern Europe. And when governments are cash-strapped, there is a knee-jerk reaction or tendency to turn on the selfish gene on the part of many countries. So we, for example, close borders, especially external borders outside Schengen. We don't let people in because there might come a virus, there can be some security issues, terrorists, and there is this logic to be closer to home and to not to pay attention very much to the outside world. It would be very dangerous logic that would go against the very interests of Europe and also certain moral responsibilities. So when we think about the global South, when we think about sub-Saharan Africa, when we think about MENA region and Morocco, we need to understand that many people's livelihoods to much larger extent have been affected through the coronavirus. Not only because the virus is there as well, but also because the economic links have been severed. For example, remittances have stopped flowing. There are less channels of less channels of legal migration. Trade has been suffering. Of course, there is no tourism in the proper sense, which creates additional budgetary problems for the countries of, say, Northern Africa. So the point I'd like to make is that on the one hand, on the very global level, there needs to be an effort from rich countries to extend a helping hand. And for example, recently there was a very far-reaching decision of G20 countries to annul some of the debts, to forgive some of the debts of the global South. But I think it's not enough. It's a huge responsibility for the European Union to keep the assistance aid flowing, but also to think of new channels of cooperation that could be taken up in the emergency mode through the crisis, as we live through the pandemic and as we leave this emergency mode after the pandemic.
So I'm very glad you mentioned that, and especially I would give the floor to Antonio, but Antonio, you mentioned also liberal values and norms being at the core of the European Union, and we are seeing that migration issues are being responded also in somehow illiberal manners. I see that, for example, the new government in Greece, the government Mitsotakis has decided to only give 1 month's residence for the refugee instead of 6 months before in order to examine the file. So it's obvious, and the whole migration policy of the EU is very chaotic, and each country is having our burden. Some of the countries, such as Italy, have tried in the past to make agreement with departure countries. They are still not sufficient. There are still people dying in the sea, and this is looked by the Southern Mediterranean people and African people as somehow a treason of the liberal values Europe is promoting on international stage. So how can we craft a true political message to these countries?
Well, we have to be very sincere, I think. Think of Italy, one of the main entrants for African migrants to Europe, together with Greece. Well, if there is a change of government in Italy, for instance, the right wing, wins with the Northern League. I mean, the Italian policies on migration would change radically. We already saw it last year with the first government under Giuseppe Conte, and with Salvini as Minister of Interior. I don't want to say whether it is good or bad. I mean, what is important that, it is enough, to have a change in governments, to have a completely change in terms of migration policy. It is a very telling example, because it means that there is no European policy on migration. Because, if there is a change in leadership in one country, you have a completely different, policy. And also, as a side effect, as a sort of European policy, but which was not intended to be a European policy. It's just, the consequence of the Italian policy on migration, because we are still, discussing, the Dublin rules, for instance. How many proposals I've seen over the last years on the reform of this. We were not able to do so. So this is really the bet for next year. Are we really able, to finally, manage all the other issues which are not strictly related to the COVID-19, because they will be back after COVID-19 and after a recovery will be back. And we have to speak the truth. For instance, why don't we say very clearly, and there is very wide empirical evidence that the European Union contributed to local disparities inside each country. Otherwise, we will never understand why in Greater London they voted to remain in the European Union, while in peripheral areas in Wales or somewhere else, I mean, they voted to leave the European Union, because the European Union, I'm not saying for bad reasons, it is really contributing to local disparities, to regional disparities inside each country. This problem is going to remain, and we are not serious when we say, but we have the cohesion funds, you know, to tackle this issue. Come on, the cohesion funds is just a small percentage of the EU budget, which is 1% of the EU GDP. Are we really serious that we are able and willing to face such a huge trend with such a small amount of money? So this is the real challenge, you know, to live immobilism, you know, as we did with COVID, but for all the other, you know, challenges we had in the past, and we are going to have again in the near future.
Thank you very much, Antonio. We are going to close to the end of this session, but I would like to give you a last opportunity to comment, and maybe beginning with you, Bertie, because Ireland has been benefiting a lot of the EU Cohesion Regional Fund, but in a sense, what's being said by Antonio is that it's not doing it all. You know, the Irish economic success is also due to a specific fiscal policy, the implementation of economic policy by the national government, and so so in each European country, each people should know where the responsibility lie. I mean, which domain are the domain of the European Union, which is what are the issues to be tackled by national governments, and somehow it's sometimes been blurred by anti-European speeches. So what is your take on this?
Can I just mention one other thing first? You asked the
Sure.
question earlier on about on the health area, while the competencies are with individual countries. I think one of the opportunities that the European Union will have, they have already ordered 300 million doses of the vaccine, both from Pfizer and Entech. I think that's probably 150 million if you take it that there's going to have to be a double dose 3 weeks apart. But the distribution and the effectiveness of how that is done, the EU are going to have a role in that now, probably for the first time in a health issue. So I think the competence that they show in handling that, which will probably come April or May or whenever around, I think that will be a big issue. So that's that. On the other question which you were raising, I mean, I think in the end of the day, like we can't be always looking to Brussels, looking to the EU to deal with problems. We have to deal with issues ourselves. And I think, you know, on issues of education and health, which are the big issues that we still have total control over, we have to deal with. But I do think there's an opportunity with the next generation EU issue to show that it's not just all about getting a slice of the 750 million, that it is, are we serious about following the structural reforms that are being put up to us? And they are issues. And I take Antonio's point. There are regions that where we have the inequalities, where we have to work, and particularly for education for less well off people, and we have to do that. And I think we have to do that ourselves. You can't be building up rich economic zones and then wonder why other regions feel that they're left behind and that they're ignored. So I mean that is a challenge, and it's It's a challenge. The people that know these regions best are the domestic government and the domestic system. So Antonio's point is well taken. I have to say, I'm not too sure that was the issue in the UK. In the UK, they listened to madmen selling them mad policies, and said if you leave the European Union, you're standing up for the sovereignty of the United Kingdom, and all will be great, and the National Health Scheme will save all the money that goes to Europe. But anyway, I'm glad to see they're beginning to realise, and I hope they don't suffer too much in the process, but they are beginning to realise the mistake of that. But I do think regional inequalities are a big part of it. The other point on the EU money, I just think I understand, and I think all of us in this distinguished panel understand, that there are rules to the money, and the 2021 that national governments have to submit their plans to Brussels. Those plans are going to have to be examined, and the rollout of the money might be 23 or 24. But our electorates and our people in our countries don't understand that. And if it comes to 2024 and there's no money hitting the regions and no money hitting the countries, I think people will get very frustrated very quick. So I think the management, the good news of July, of the 750 million backed by Europe in a collective way is great news. But if that money does not start hitting into regions till 2024, I think the electorates will very, because they don't understand that, they will be very united. So I think Europe and sovereign governments have to be very, I don't understand why it's going to take to 2024. So I don't understand. The electorates certainly aren't going to understand. So I think this issue is going to have to be dealt with very carefully and quickly.
Thank you very much, Bade. Georgios, maybe a word on what's been said on this panel, a final word.
Just, I think we've had a very rich discussion, and we could continue for hours, but I agree with just a major point, which I think comes out of this discussion. Bertie was saying it earlier, we are not an island. Nobody is an island. We see that Brexit was an illusion, I think. Some people still live in that illusion, but that's another one, that as an island, you can do things. We are impacted by global issues, global challenges. And this is, I think, where the EU has an advantage if it uses it, that we are stronger together. The health area is one new area for the competencies of the European Union, but it has shown that we can work together. And obviously the fact that we are buying vaccines, or at least procuring the future vaccine together to be distributed equitably, shows the possibilities we have. Now, I just want to say that, talking about the vaccine, there will be a pressure, and there is a pressure for any leader, and I've gone through this, and I'm sure others would agree, that when you face a crisis, the pressure on you is go back to normal, bring things back to normal. It's not really a pressure of let's reinvent, let's rethink, let's reimagine. I hope that the vaccine will not stop our creative thinking and our political will to really look at the issues that are at hand, which are not just the pandemic. There are, as others have said, the inequities, our relationship to our bigger neighborhoods, migration, refugees, Africa, how we really help Africa stand on its own 2 feet, make it a positive story rather than a challenge and a fear. And I think this is where we do need to think of not simply market solutions, but also social solutions. That's what we're talking about, and that's what won out basically in the US too. That you need health system, the education system, and of course the 750 billion is very important. But also the European Parliament has moved forward with even new ideas, because as Antonio said, the resources we have for cohesion are small, but we're looking now into our own resources. So the issue of like financial transaction tax has been put on the table. Actually, was put on the table 10 years ago when I was prime minister, but it didn't go through. Greenhouse gases, I would add the issue of tax havens, it was one of our major problems in Greece. The financial system helped move out money from our country when we were trying to pay off our debt, trying to raise taxes, and this, of course, has. So what we have is the inequities are not simply, between the cities and the rural area. There is a global system of inequities which need global regulation of some form, where Europe can stand up and move. Now, some will say in these discussions in America, were tried to be portrayed as socialist versus liberal or neoliberal or whatever. But of course, in Florida, what was discussed, what was used by the sort of social media was that all these people who were talking about healthcare and education, they were Maduro supporters, they were Chavez supporters, they want an authoritarian system. Had nothing to do. This was just a label to bring back, the sort of fear that had nothing to do with the real policies which we had to deal with. But of course, it did affect the elections. But I know Joe Biden very well. I've worked with him as others have, and he's a person which is both logical, but also with great empathy. And I think that he wants to deal with these issues, which are big social issues and have created polarization and created the possibility for these authoritarian figures to come out and blame anybody else, the Chinese, the Mexicans, racial disparities, as or racial supremacy as the issues of the day, when we really have to look at some of the social inequities that are there if we really want to make things change. So Europe, I think, has a great challenge, a great opportunity, but it's not going to be easy to deal with all these problems. But if we learn from this experience and these past experiences of crises, we take the lessons from this, and we do not become complacent once this COVID, which we hope is over very soon, and we get a vaccine. And as I agree with Bertie, it's not going to be so soon, because by the time the vaccine is out, it'll take quite a few months. But still, if we don't go back to complacency and we do use this opportunity as a way to move forward and think through different things for what Europe can do, that would be a positive outcome and an optimistic one.
Thank you very much for that comment. It feels like it's a perfect Monday to start a European journey. And Davi, maybe a word.
Well, I like that the very pessimistic headline of this discussion has turned to a very optimistic debate, and that's very, very, very positive. If we don't have hope, then who does? And then this is like important to keep up the good vibe. I just want to very quickly mention this, what you were asking or saying about cohesion. My country, that was 50 years occupied by essentially a failed system, has benefited so much because of EU cohesion, because of the funds, even though it's like, I agree that it's only 1% GDP, but what we can see that it has helped during this 15 or 16 years that we have been members, basically to overcome 5 decades of insufficient investments, and this is like a really, really important thing. And in the future, I think when Estonia and also Lithuania, for that matter, we are like just on the brink of becoming net contributors, and not next time yet, or the next MFF yet, but probably right after that. And we are very much interested that with the funds that we use together, we will actually take things next level. And I hope that the plan at European level to push forward both the climate deal and also digital disruption, just to take things next level that wouldn't be taken any otherwise, that perhaps even the crisis helps a bit to achieve this, and we will actually achieve that. And I fully agree with Georgios that there's no chance of taking things back to the previous normal, that the new normal will be completely different. The way that we have been interacting with each other, having conferences over Zoom is one of those examples. We will see work changing a lot. We will have more people working remotely, which in a way is a good thing for distant or less developed regions, because I could easily live on an island. My favorite island, by the way, is island of Crete, Ios Nikolaos. This beautiful areas. I would love to. I would live there and work across Zoom. And if I'm not the person doing that, I know that many people will do that. So in a way, again, if we look at the positive impacts and if we use the crisis wisely, it could actually contribute a lot to making regions more equal and getting rid of those disparities. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacob. A word also on maybe also the pro-European feelings that could be also something very much consistent and existent in Central and Eastern European countries.
Well, surely there is a very good signal coming from across the Atlantic. Joe Biden brings a different dynamic. Many Central Europeans who are not populist and who don't have populist instincts are cheering, because finally there is a president who will not drive a wedge into the heart of Europe by trying to stoke Euroscepticism and by creating divisions within Europe, by calling Europe a strategic foe or enemy. So countries like Slovakia do not have to choose between mommy and daddy. Mommy meaning European Union providing this kind of soft social economic security, and daddy being responsible for the hard security. These things surely help. There is a good spirit of cooperation, even if it's not possible to go back to the times of old transatlantic alliance, because the gravity of the global economy has changed, has moved towards Southeast Asia. I believe that there is a lot on the plate, on the agenda of Europe and America, coming up together with solutions as regards, for example, such a bone of contention as digital tax, privacy laws, data, flow of data, etc. So a lot on our plate, but I'm very optimistic that we can handle it together.
Thank you very much, Jacob. And Antonio, maybe a final word also?
Very, very briefly. I mean, next year will be really a challenging year because, you know, especially in terms of social effects of the crisis, it will be really key. Because, for instance, take Italy, but in many other countries, we have suspended firings at the moment. You cannot be fired, okay, from your job. But of course, this cannot be continued over. There are a lot of redundancy funds, of course, going on for workers, but we cannot continue like that. So, I mean, unfortunately, the burden in terms of employment may be felt next year, much more than this year. So that's why we have to be alert, both at the European and the national level, because next year will be really crucial to build a solid recovery.
Well, that's an excellent conclusion, and I must say that back to the normal for the MEDays Institute is, as you know, next year for you to be invited in Tangier and to have a new wonderful discussion there. And I must thank you all very much for your thorough and insightful examination of the European stakes at the time being, and I hope you have a great day ahead, and we will meet soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.